Daniel had always been someone who preferred quiet moments over loud ones. He was the kind of person who could sit alone at a cafe for an hour, just watching the world move around him, without feeling lonely or out of place. On this particular morning, he had taken a bus to a small town where his sister lived. He had come here many times before, but lately life had been too busy, too full of responsibilities and decisions and people needing him every second. So the trip felt like a breath of fresh air. He wanted a peaceful day before meeting his sister in the afternoon. The town was small enough that the streets had a calm rhythm. People moved slower. Cars passed with less noise. Daniel walked down the main road with a small backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't dressed fancy. He wore simple clothes, comfortable, ordinary, nothing that stood out. That was how he liked it. People often overlooked him, and he never minded. In fact, he found comfort in blending in. It allowed him to see the world without being seen too much by it. He stopped at a cozy cafe on the corner of the street. The door chimed softly when he entered. Inside, the smell of warm pastries and coffee drifted toward him. A few people were scattered at different tables, some reading the newspaper, some talking quietly. The atmosphere was pleasant, the kind that made a person breathe a little easier. Daniel ordered a cup of tea and a small breakfast plate, then chose a seat by the window where he could enjoy the view of the quiet street. He pulled out a worn notebook from his bag, flipping it open to a blank page. He always carried this notebook with him. Sometimes he wrote ideas. Sometimes he wrote reminders. Sometimes he wrote absolutely nothing, just looked at the empty pages until a thought came. Today he drew simple lines and shapes, letting his mind settle. The world outside felt peaceful. He felt peaceful. But peace does not always last. Sometimes all it takes is a small spark in the wrong place for everything to change. Daniel did not notice the woman sitting 2 tables behind him. She had been glancing at him since he walked in. She wasn't a bad person. She was simply jumpy, nervous by nature. And when she saw Daniel reach into his bag earlier, looking for his notebook, she somehow convinced herself that he was doing something suspicious. She whispered to the man beside her, and in minutes, an unnecessary wave of worry grew between the two of them. Instead of coming forward or ignoring their own imaginations, they decided to call the police. They told the officer on the phone that a man was acting strangely at the cafe. They didn't know what he was doing, but they felt something was off. The officer asked a few questions, and the woman described Daniel with unnecessary dramatic detail. When she hung up, she felt she had done something helpful, something responsible, even though there was truly no reason for concern. Daniel remained unaware of all this. He continued sipping his tea, writing a few lines in his notebook. The warm drink soothed his throat. The chair felt comfortable under him. He didn't feel like someone who was about to be interrupted by 2 officers who had received a misleading report. Outside, a police car pulled up to the curb. A couple sitting near the window noticed it and whispered to each other. The officers stepped out, one older, one younger, and walked toward the cafe door. The older one scanned the inside through the glass before entering. People inside slowly turned their heads. The officers always drew attention, no matter the situation. Daniel didn't look up. He didn't think they had anything to do with him. Why would they? He had done nothing wrong, not even spoken to anyone yet. The officers walked straight to his table. "Sir, we need a word with you," the older officer said in a firm tone. Daniel finally looked up, surprised. His eyes were calm, not confused, just waiting for the explanation. "Is something wrong?" "We got a call," the younger officer said, crossing his arms. "Someone reported suspicious behavior. You're matching the description." Daniel blinked gently. "Suspicious? I'm just having breakfast. We'll ask the questions," the older officer replied, his tone sharp but controlled. People in the cafe grew quieter. Conversations faded. Forks and mugs paused in midair. Everyone watched, their curiosity rising faster than their caution. Daniel didn't want to make the moment bigger than it needed to be. "Of course. What would you like to know?" he asked politely. The officers exchanged a look as if his calmness was unexpected. The younger one stepped forward slightly, his stance defensive for no reason. "Where are you from? What are you doing here?" "Visiting my sister," Daniel answered simply. "I came early and stopped for tea. The officers didn't seem satisfied. They kept their eyes narrowed, searching his face for some sign of guilt. It was almost as if they were determined to find something wrong, even if nothing was there. "Do you have identification?" the older one asked. "Yes," Daniel said, reaching slowly toward his backpack. He moved carefully so they wouldn't misread his actions. He opened the bag, took out his wallet, and handed over his ID. The older officer studied it, but irritation still lingered in his expression. It was the irritation of someone who didn't want to admit they might be wrong. The younger officer kept pushing. "What were you doing when you reached into your bag earlier?" "That's when someone called." Daniel felt a small sigh in his chest, but he didn't let it show. "I took out my notebook." "Notebook?" the younger one repeated, as if the word itself sounded suspicious. Daniel opened the notebook gently and showed them the page with a few shapes and lines. "This one." The officers stared at it, but their suspicion didn't fade. They had already convinced themselves that something wasn't right. The younger officer looked around at the people staring back at them. He didn't like being watched. It made him push harder, trying to look in control. "We'll need you to come outside for more questioning." Daniel nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or question their tone. He simply closed his notebook, slid it into his bag, and stood. The cafe fell into a deeper silence as Daniel walked toward the door. Guided by the officers, he noticed all the eyes watching him. Some looked worried. Some looked curious. Some looked convinced he had done something wrong. It was strange how fast a harmless moment could turn into a spectacle. Outside, the air felt cooler. A soft breeze brushed across the street. Daniel stood calmly on the sidewalk while the officers continued with their questions. "Why are you in this town today?" the younger officer repeated. "As I said," Daniel answered patiently, "to visit my sister." The older officer stepped closer. "Look, something about this isn't adding up. You're too calm. People usually panic when police question them." Daniel met his eyes. "Respectfully, officer, calm doesn't mean guilty." The older officer didn't like the answer. He frowned, his jaw tightening. The younger officer tapped his foot, looking around the street. "We might need to bring you to the station just to sort this out." Daniel saw the situation growing heavier. Their assumptions were stacking up like bricks, closing him into a corner he didn't belong in. They didn't know who he really was. They didn't know the kind of responsibilities he carried, or the level of trust placed in him by people who made major national decisions. They only saw a quiet man in simple clothes, and they assumed that meant he had no power. "Before you take me anywhere," Daniel said softly, "I need to make one phone call." The younger officer let out a short laugh. "A phone call? To who?" "Someone who can help clear this up." Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't act dramatic. He just spoke with the same calm tone he always used. The older officer shrugged. "Fine, make your call, but it won't change anything until we finish here." He stepped a few feet away, enough to create a small circle of privacy, but still within their sight. The officers watched him with half amusement, half annoyance. Daniel took out his phone, unlocked it slowly, and dialed a number most people could not even imagine having access to. The phone rang only once. "This is Central Operations." A clear voice answered on the other end. Daniel's tone shifted, not louder. Not dramatic, but precise, firm, and unmistakably professional. "This is Daniel requesting immediate protocol support. I am in an unexpected detainment situation at roadside location. Verification required." On the other end, the voice changed instantly. "Understood, sir. Stand by." Daniel remained calm as he spoke. His posture straightened. His expression sharpened, and though the officers couldn't hear the full conversation, the change in his tone caught their attention. They exchanged a look, something between confusion and the first hints of doubt. Inside the cafe, the woman who had made the call earlier peeked out the window. She watched Daniel speaking on the phone. Unaware of the chaos she had started, Daniel ended the call with a quiet thank you. Then he lowered his phone and turned back to the officers. "We should wait a few minutes," he said softly. "For what?" the younger officer asked, scoffing. Daniel didn't answer. He simply stood still, looking down the street. The breeze moved gently across his face, as if even the wind knew something was about to change. The officers remained impatient. They didn't understand why this man seemed so sure of himself now. They thought he was powerless. They thought he had no voice, no influence, no connection that mattered. They were wrong, and they were about to find out how wrong. The quiet street, the cafe customers, the officers themselves, none of them knew that Daniel's simple phone call had just reached one of the most secure offices in the country. They did not know. Someone at the Pentagon had already begun moving things into place. But they would know. Soon, very soon. Daniel stood quietly on the sidewalk. His hands relaxed at his sides as the two officers watched him with growing impatience. The morning air was still cool, and the quiet street looked almost untouched, as if it didn't expect anything unusual to happen that day. People walked by slowly, taking short glances at the scene but continuing on their way. No one knew the weight of the phone call Daniel had just made. Not the officers, not the curious cafe customers, and certainly not the woman who had started all of this with her restless imagination. The younger officer paced back and forth with short steps, tapping his fingers against his belt. He kept glancing at Daniel as if he expected him to suddenly reveal something suspicious. But Daniel just stood calmly, his expression steady, his breathing even. There was no sign of fear on his face, no panic, no anger. It made the younger officer uneasy. The older officer crossed his arms and fixed his eyes on Daniel. "You know," he said, sounding almost annoyed, "most people don't act like this when they're questioned by police." Daniel met his gaze with gentle steadiness. "I understand. But I don't see a reason to react any differently. I know everything will be sorted out soon." The younger officer let out a short laugh. "Sorted out? How? You think your little phone call is going to change something?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't feel the need to explain himself to someone who wasn't ready to listen. He simply looked down the road again, waiting. He knew help was already in motion, even though the officers didn't. The older officer sighed heavily. "Look, just tell us who you called. This can go a lot smoother if you cooperate." Daniel paused for a moment before speaking. "Someone who can confirm that the two of you are making a mistake." The younger officer stepped forward. "A mistake? Listen, we're doing our job. We got a call. You matched the description. That's how it works." Daniel nodded softly. "I understand that. I'm not upset with you for responding to a call. What matters is what you choose to do once you realize the call was based on fear, not facts." The younger officer felt challenged by that answer and frowned deeply. He opened his mouth to say something but closed it again when he saw the older officer raise a hand to stop him. The older officer grumbled under his breath. "Let's just see who shows up, if anyone even does." Inside the cafe, people continued to whisper to each other. The woman who had made the call pressed her face closer to the window. She kept expecting something dramatic to happen, but all she saw was a quiet man standing beneath the soft sunlight, not causing anyone harm. A small flicker of doubt appeared in her chest for the first time. She wondered if perhaps she had made a mistake. A big one. Daniel adjusted the strap of his backpack on his shoulder as he waited. He wasn't in any hurry. He had learned long ago that silence often revealed truth faster than arguments. He had also learned that people judged quickly, sometimes too quickly. And sometimes, those judgments led to problems much larger than they expected. The younger officer finally stopped pacing and leaned against the police car. "You know," he said, looking at Daniel with narrowed eyes, "your calm attitude is strange. Are you hiding something?" Daniel shook his head gently. "No, I've just lived long enough to know that not every misunderstanding needs anger to be solved." The older officer gave a half snort. "Well, misunderstandings or not, we still have to take this seriously." Daniel knew that the officers weren't bad people. They weren't cruel. But they were blinded by their assumptions. They saw an ordinary man sitting alone, dressed simply, carrying a small bag. They didn't see anything beyond that. And because the call they received described him as suspicious, they let their minds add shadows where there were none. "Can I ask you both something?" Daniel said suddenly. The officers exchanged a brief glance. "What is it?" The older one asked. What would have happened, Daniel said, if you had walked in and simply asked me if everything was okay? Or if you had looked around before assuming I was the problem? Things might have gone differently, right? The younger officer lifted his chin defensively. We responded the way we were trained. Daniel nodded. I respect that. But training doesn't replace understanding. And understanding doesn't come from force. It comes from listening. The younger officer's lips tightened. He didn't like being corrected, even gently. Maybe you should listen to us then, too. We have protocols. I know you do, Dana replied calmly. That's why I made my own call. The older officer raised an eyebrow. Your own protocol? Daniel didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Moments later, the quiet street shifted. Birds flew off a nearby tree as a distant hum filled the air. Not a loud one. Not frightening. Just the unmistakable sound of engines approaching with purpose. The younger officer straightened his back. You expecting someone? He asked sharply. Daniel didn't answer. His eyes remained on the road. Within seconds, a pair of dark vehicles turned the corner. Not police cars. Not local transportation. These were vehicles with no markings, tinted windows, and a smooth, strong build. The kind of vehicles that didn't need labels because everyone recognized what they represented. The officers blinked in confusion. The vehicles moved with calm confidence, stopping near the cafe. Doors opened, almost in perfect coordination. 3 individuals stepped out, 2 men and 1 woman, all of them dressed in neat formal clothing, moving with a quiet sense of authority. Not loud, not dramatic. Just clear. The younger officer froze. The older one blinked as if he wasn't sure he was seeing correctly. The woman approached first. She carried a small badge that she revealed just long enough to confirm her role. The officers didn't get a close enough look to read the text, but they saw the symbol. The symbol alone was enough to make their stomachs tighten. We're here for him, the woman said, her tone respectful as she gestured toward Daniel. The younger officer stepped back slightly. For him. Wait, who exactly is he? The woman didn't answer directly. Instead, she turned to Daniel. Sir, we received your call. Are you all right? Daniel nodded. Yes, thank you for coming. The older officer swallowed hard. His voice shook slightly. Can someone explain what's going on? He was acting suspicious. But one of the men from the vehicle shook his head gently, stopping the officer mid-sentence. You acted on false information, he said. There was no threat here. The situation should have been assessed more carefully. The younger officer felt heat rising in his face. We were doing our job. Someone called. We had to respond. Responding is one thing, the man said calmly. Escalating without understanding is another. The older officer felt the weight of those words. He realized not fully, but enough that they had misjudged the situation badly. Daniel didn't speak for a moment. He let the silence settle. His calm presence seemed even more powerful now, surrounded by people who clearly knew him and respected him. The woman turned to the officers with a small nod. You may not have known who he is, but he is someone who holds a position of great responsibility. He is trusted at the highest levels, and he deserves the same respect as any citizen, if not more. The younger officer looked at Daniel again, not with suspicion this time, but with disbelief. You work with them? Daniel sighed softly. I work quietly. I prefer it that way. I didn't want to make this situation bigger than it already was. I just needed it handled correctly. The older officer looked down at the ground. We didn't know. You didn't seem like. Daniel lifted his head slightly. Like someone with power? That's the thing. Power doesn't always look the way you expect. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's simple. And sometimes it's wearing ordinary clothes, enjoying tea in a small cafe. The words struck deeper than he intended. The older officer let out a slow breath, shame creeping into his expression. We're sorry, he finally said, his voice low. Truly. The younger officer opened his mouth, but closed it again. He didn't know what to say. His earlier confidence had faded completely. Daniel nodded gently. It's all right. What matters is what you learn from this. The woman stepped forward. Sir, we can escort you if you'd like. Daniel looked toward the cafe. Through the window, the woman who had called the police was still staring, her face pale. He didn't blame her. Fear made people see things that weren't there. Yes, Daniel replied softly. Let's go. I have a schedule to keep. As they walked him toward the vehicle, the younger officer called out, Wait, what should we tell our department? Daniel paused before getting in. Tell them to listen first. Judge later. It saves a lot of trouble. The door closed gently behind him. The officer stood in silence as the vehicles pulled away. A quiet emptiness filled the street again, but the weight of what happened remained heavy in the air. Daniel didn't look back. He didn't need to. He knew everything had changed already, and the day wasn't even over. The drive away from the cafe was quiet at first. Daniel sat in the back seat of the unmarked vehicle, looking out the window as the small town passed by slowly. The morning light had shifted a little, brightening the streets that had felt calm only an hour earlier. Now, everything seemed to carry a different weight. The officers were no longer around him, but their assumptions, their tone, and their quick judgment still lingered in his thoughts. The woman seated beside him, the one who had spoken to the officers, glanced at him respectfully. She didn't try to fill the silence with unnecessary words. She knew him well enough to understand that he preferred quiet until he was ready to speak. The man in the front passenger seat finally broke the silence. Sir, we apologize for the delay in responding. We moved as quickly as we could once your call came in. Daniel nodded softly. I know, and I appreciate it. The driver, who had been focused on the road, spoke next. We coordinated with Central within 4 minutes of your call. They informed us the officers had already escalated the situation. Daniel let out a slow breath. They weren't malicious, just misled. Fear can do that to people. The woman tilted her head. Fear usually comes from misunderstanding, or a lack of awareness. Both, Daniel said gently, and sometimes from habits that haven't been corrected. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even frustrated anymore. But he understood something important had happened, something that would ripple far beyond that quiet sidewalk. The car turned toward the northern side of town, where his sister lived in a small, warm house with pale blue curtains and a garden she was proud of. Daniel had promised her he would arrive by noon, and he didn't like breaking promises, even small ones. But the woman beside him suddenly cleared her throat. Sir, before we take you to your sister's home, Central requested that we stop at a designated location nearby. They said it's urgent. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. He knew what that meant. Understood. Let's go there first. The driver changed direction immediately. They drove toward an open area on the edge of town, a place with a few old warehouses and long stretches of fence. It wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't lively either. A perfect place for quiet conversations no one should overhear. When the vehicles pulled in, there were already 2 more unmarked cars waiting. Daniel stepped out, greeted by a man with a calm and serious face. Thank you for coming, the man said with a slight bow of respect. I didn't have a choice, Daniel replied softly. The situation at the cafe forced an early response. The man nodded. We received your verification. It raised immediate concern on our side. We needed to make sure you weren't being held longer than necessary. Daniel looked up at the wide sky. It's over now. Let's focus on what's ahead. The man gestured toward a nearby warehouse where a temporary setup had been arranged. Inside, tables, communication devices, and folders were neatly organized. A few people in quiet professional clothing moved around without noise, each absorbed in their tasks. Daniel walked inside and set his bag on the table. Any new developments? He asked. The man shook his head. Nothing critical, but Central wants you to review a few items before your next check-in. Daniel nodded and opened the file folder that had been placed there for him. The pages inside were clean, organized, and filled with information only a handful of people had access to. For several minutes, he read silently. His calm expression didn't change, but his eyes moved with sharp focus over every detail. The woman who had accompanied him watched him with quiet respect. She knew that when Daniel read, he absorbed everything deeply, almost effortlessly. When he finished the last page, he closed the folder. "This will require follow-up." "But not today." "Understood," the man said. The warehouse door opened, and a soft breeze drifted in. Daniel stepped outside again, breathing in the fresh air. Moments like this always reminded him of why he preferred silence in small towns over loud, crowded environments. The woman approached him. "Sir, may I ask something?" "Of course." "When the officers questioned you, did you ever feel unsafe?" Daniel thought about it. "Not unsafe. Just misunderstood. And when people misunderstand, they sometimes act out of fear. That can cause harm, even without bad intentions." She nodded quietly. "They didn't see who you really were." "It's fine," Daniel said. "I don't walk around expecting people to know. If I wanted to be treated differently everywhere I went, I'd live life loudly. I don't." The woman smiled just a little. She admired him for that. Many people in his position would move with pride or demand attention. Daniel never did. He valued simplicity. He valued calm. He valued small connections, the kind you could only make when you weren't trying to prove anything. After a few minutes, the team finished preparing the final documents he needed to take with him. The man returned, handing Daniel a small sealed envelope. "This contains your next briefing schedule. Central wants confirmation before evening." Daniel nodded. "I'll review it later." He walked toward the car again. The woman opened the door for him. "Let's get to my sister's house now," Daniel said gently. "She'll be wondering why I'm late." The drive this time felt lighter. Daniel leaned back in his seat, letting the soft hum of the car relax his thoughts. Outside the window, trees shifted peacefully as the road curved toward a quieter neighborhood. When they pulled up to his sister's home, Daniel stepped out and thanked the team. The woman gave him a respectful nod. "Call us if anything changes. We'll be nearby for the next hour." "I appreciate it," Daniel replied. "I'll be fine from here." The vehicles left calmly, disappearing around the corner. Daniel walked to the front gate and gently opened it. The garden, filled with soft green leaves and a few small flowers, greeted him with familiarity. He stepped onto the porch and knocked lightly. The door opened almost immediately. His sister stood there, her face brightening at the sight of him. She wasn't someone who needed a lot of words to show love. A simple smile from her held more warmth than a long embrace. "You're late," she said with a soft laugh. Daniel returned the smile. "I know, got a little delayed. Everything okay?" she asked, looking at him more closely. Daniel nodded. "Everything's fine now. Just a misunderstanding." She didn't press for details. She trusted him enough to know that if something was important, he would share it. Inside her home, the air smelled like fresh bread. She always baked something in the mornings. Daniel set his bag down and sat at the kitchen table while she poured him a cup of warm tea. "You look tired," she said softly. "Just a long morning." Daniel replied. She placed the cup in front of him and sat across the table. "Well, you're here now. That's what matters." Daniel lifted the cup and took a slow sip. The warmth felt good. They talked for a while, discussing simple things: her garden, the weather, the neighbors, her plans for the week. Nothing heavy, nothing stressful. Just the kind of conversation Daniel needed, but somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew the cafe incident wasn't tea over. Not really. Because people talk. People assume. And people forget to ask the right questions. He knew that the officers were probably still at the scene, wondering who he was. He knew the woman who made the call was likely replaying everything in her mind, worrying whether she had judged too fast. And he knew that the department would eventually need to review what happened. He hoped they would learn something from it. Later that afternoon, Daniel stepped outside to sit on his sister's porch. The air had warmed slightly. Birds sang softly in the distance. He reached for his phone and saw a message from the team. Asterisk officers have requested clarification. How should we proceed? Daniel stared at the message for a moment. He typed back slowly. Give them what they need. No more, no less. Make sure they understand the importance of accuracy and calm judgment. We don't need another incident like this. A reply came immediately. Understood. Daniel put the phone down and leaned back in the chair. The wind moved gently around him. Everything looked peaceful again. But he knew the story wasn't finished. Somewhere out there, the officers were trying to understand what had happened. And the truth was still unfolding, one quiet moment at a time. The morning sun had climbed higher, warming the small-town street, but the tension around Daniel still hung in the air like a quiet storm waiting to break. He stood near the patrol car, calm yet alert, while the two officers paced around as if unsure what to do next. Only a few minutes had passed since his short phone call, but something in the air felt different now. Even the people at the cafe window sensed it, though they didn't know why. Daniel didn't speak. He simply waited, hands relaxed at his sides. His sister stayed close, whispering every now and then, trying to understand what he had done and who he had called. She kept glancing at him, then at the officers, then back at him again. Her worry was clear, but so was her trust. She knew him better than anyone. If he said everything would be fine, she believed it even if she didn't know how. One of the officers walked toward Daniel again, trying to act firm, but failing to hide the uneasiness in his voice. "Sir, look, we're still trying to figure things out. You can't just call whoever you called and expect us to ignore protocol." Daniel looked at him, not angry, just thoughtful. His voice remained steady. "I understand, and I'm not asking you to ignore anything. I'm just waiting for things to be cleared up." The officer opened his mouth to say something, but then closed it again. Something about Daniel's tone, or maybe the unusual confidence behind his calm behavior, made it hard for him to push further. Another minute passed, another, and then the sound came. It started faint, like distant thunder rolling over the hills. A soft rumble that made people look up from their tables. The officers froze. Daniel didn't move at all. His sister grabbed his arm gently, confused. The rumble grew louder. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't traffic. It was a convoy. Black vehicles, large, polished, and moving with exact coordination, turned onto the street. They weren't speeding, but there was an urgency in their movement, purpose that made everyone nearby step back without needing to be told. Doors of nearby shops opened as people peeked out. Some recorded with their phones, unsure what they were witnessing. The officers stared, their confusion turning quickly into concern. One officer whispered, "What on earth?" but stopped when the first vehicle pulled up right beside them. The door opened gently, not rushed, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He wasn't loud or aggressive, but the authority around him was impossible to ignore. Even people far back felt it. He walked straight toward Daniel. Double quotes, "Sir." The suited man said respectfully, "We came as quickly as possible. Are you all right?" The officers' faces dropped. The man's tone alone told them everything they had misjudged Daniel badly. Daniel nodded politely. "I'm fine. Thank you." Another vehicle door opened. Another official stepped out, followed by two more. All of them walked with the same posture, the same sense of purpose. Heading directly to Daniel, not the officers. People on the sidewalk stared in disbelief. It wasn't every day that government vehicles pulled up in a quiet street, especially for someone who had just been detained for a misunderstanding. Daniel's sister stepped back slightly, overwhelmed, watching as more officials lined up in front of him. Their expressions were serious but respectful. One of the officials spoke next. "Sir, we received your message. We apologize for the delay. Please let us know how you want to proceed." The officers didn't know where to look. They wanted to shrink into the ground. A moment earlier, they had treated Daniel like a nobody. Now these high-level officials, clearly from an important department, were addressing him like he was someone vital. Daniel finally turned toward the officers. These officers were doing their job, he said calmly. "There was a misunderstanding. I would like it resolved without trouble." His words shocked the officers even more. He wasn't angry. He wasn't demanding punishment. He wasn't using whatever power he clearly had to embarrass them. But the officials still turned to the officers, their tone turning sharper. "Misunderstanding or not," one said, "you detain someone without listening, and you ignored repeated statements that he needed to make an urgent call. You also dismissed the concerns of a civilian who tried to explain. The officers swallowed hard. Their hands twitched at their belts. They couldn't defend themselves. They knew it. Daniel stepped in gently. Let's not escalate this. I'm fine now. It's enough that the situation is clear. The officials exchanged looks. Then they nodded. If Daniel wanted peace, they would honor that. The officer who had been the harshest looked down and finally managed to speak. Barely above a whisper, "Sir, we're sorry. We truly didn't know." Daniel nodded. "I know you didn't." Then the street fell quiet. The cafe workers stepped closer to the windows. People holding their phones slowly lowered them, unsure if it was even appropriate to record such a moment. Daniel's sister stepped forward, still processing the new reality. "I had no idea," she whispered. Daniel gave her a small smile. "It's fine. You don't need to worry." Another official approached Daniel respectfully. "Sir, your schedule for the day needs to be adjusted. Do you want us to escort you now? Or would you prefer to speak with your sister first?" Daniel looked at his sister. Her eyes were full of questions, hundreds of them, but mostly relief. "I'll take a moment," he said. The official stepped back without hesitation. Meanwhile, the officers looked completely shaken, not only because of who Daniel clearly was, but because of how he handled the situation. He wasn't arrogant. He wasn't trying to make them look bad. His calmness made their actions feel even heavier. Daniel walked a few steps away with his sister so they could talk privately. She finally asked, "What exactly do you do?" He took a soft breath. "It's complicated, and not something I can talk about in detail. But just know I'm involved in certain national projects, things that require attention and responsibility." She nodded slowly. She didn't fully understand, but she knew her brother. If he said he couldn't share details, she respected it. Across the street, the officers remained frozen in place as two of the officials approached them. They didn't yell, but their tone was firm. "You must remember something important," one official said. "You never know who you're speaking to. Everyone deserves respect. Not because of rank or position, but because you don't know their story." The officers nodded quickly. "Understood," they muttered. Daniel walked back toward them, his steps calm. When he reached them, he gave a small nod. "It's all right," he said softly. "Just listen more next time. People often tell you the truth if you let them finish speaking." The officers didn't know how to respond except with another quiet apology. A moment later, one of the officials opened the door of a waiting vehicle for Daniel. His sister gave him a quick hug, relieved that things had ended peacefully. Daniel stepped into the car, still composed, still gentle in his movements. The officials closed the door and took their positions. The convoy prepared to move out, engines humming softly. People watched in awe, realizing they had witnessed something rare: power handled with calmness, an authority used with humility. As the vehicles rolled away, the officers stood quietly, replaying everything that had happened. They knew this day would stay with them for a long time, not because they had been corrected, but because they had learned something much bigger. Respect wasn't about rank. Respect wasn't about uniforms. Respect was about people, and Daniel, the man they thought was powerless, had shown them that in the gentlest possible way. The streets slowly returned to normal, but the lesson stayed, and everyone who saw it knew they would never forget the day. A simple phone call changed everything. The convoy moved smoothly along the quiet road, the sound of its engines low and steady, but Daniel sat inside the vehicle with a calm expression that didn't quite match the weight of the moment. He looked out the window as the small town slowly faded away behind him. The sunlight played across the buildings, the sidewalks, and the corners where he had spent years visiting his sister. Yet today, everything felt different. Not because of what had happened, but because of how people had looked at him afterward, with a mix of confusion, curiosity, and respect. He didn't enjoy moments like this. The attention felt too heavy, too loud for the kind of life he liked to keep. He preferred quiet rooms, focused conversations, and tasks that most people would never hear about. He had chosen this work not for praise or recognition, but because he believed he could help in ways that mattered. Still, he knew days like this were sometimes unavoidable. Across from him sat one of the officials who had arrived in the convoy. The man didn't speak at first. He simply watched Daniel with a thoughtful expression, waiting until the vehicle settled into a smooth, steady pace. "Sir," the official finally said, "I want to apologize again. We had no idea the situation had escalated like that." "Gosh." Daniel shook his head gently. "It wasn't your fault. Misunderstandings happen. What matters is how we respond to them," the official nodded. "Even so, the department still wants a complete report. That includes your side of things. We want to ensure protocols are followed more carefully next time." Daniel gave a soft sigh. "I'll provide what I can, but I don't want trouble for those officers. They made a mistake." "People do." The official studied him for a moment longer, then slowly nodded. There was something about Daniel's way of speaking that calmed even tense moments. Steadying presence that made people listen. The convoy continued on, leaving the town behind. After nearly 20 minutes, the vehicles pulled into a peaceful spot near a local government facility. The place wasn't grand or loud. It was simple, quiet, and secure, exactly the kind of place Daniel felt comfortable in. As he stepped out of the vehicle, the rest of the team gathered around him, waiting for instructions. They weren't acting out of fear or pressure. They respected him, not because of rank or power, but because of the kind of person he was: humble, consistent, calm. "I'll finish my call inside," Daniel said. "Then I'd like some time alone." "It's been a long morning." "Of course, sir," someone replied immediately. He walked toward the entrance with measured steps, his mind already shifting back to the work he had set aside earlier that day. Important tasks, sensitive matters, things that couldn't wait forever. But even as he prepared to return to his responsibilities, he couldn't shake the image of the officers. Faces when they realized who they were dealing with. He didn't blame them, not truly. They had acted quickly, maybe too quickly, but their job often required it. Still, he hoped the moment had left an impression they wouldn't forget. Inside the building, the lights were soft and the air cool. Daniel stepped into a private room, closing the door behind him. The quiet settled around him like a warm blanket. He took a slow breath and finally sat down. He reached for his phone, not to call someone with authority this time, but to send a short message to his sister. Asterisk, everything is all right. Take the afternoon to rest. I'll see you soon. Asterisk. He put the phone aside and rubbed his forehead gently. Sometimes, the most tiring moments weren't the ones filled with action or conflict. They were the ones that stirred memories or emotions he had tried to keep tucked away. He thought of the small town where he grew up with his sister, the quiet streets, the old grocery store, the little bus stop on the corner. Life hadn't always been easy. They had seen their share of uncertainty, worry, and long nights wondering how things would turn out. Maybe that was why he had learned to stay calm in difficult moments. Panic never helped. A soft knock sounded on the door. "Come in," Daniel said. One of the officials stepped inside with a folder in hand. "Sir, the initial report is ready. We can finalize it whenever you're comfortable." Daniel nodded and gestured for him to sit. "Let's go through it now. I'd rather finish everything today." The official sat down and opened the folder. They began reviewing the details: the mistaken identity report, the officer's response, Daniel's call, and the arrival of the team. Daniel answered questions calmly, never focusing on blame or embarrassment. Instead, he emphasized clarity, communication, and the importance of treating people fairly. After they finished, the official closed the folder with a thoughtful expression. "You handled everything with so much patience, sir. Most people in your position would have reacted differently." Daniel gave a small smile. "Anger doesn't fix anything. Listening does." The official nodded. "If everyone thought like that, the world would be different." Daniel stood from his chair, signaling the end of the meeting. The official rose as well. "Thank you for everything today," Daniel said. "Thank you, sir." Once the official left, Daniel remained in the room a few minutes longer. The quiet helped settle his thoughts. He didn't like causing a scene, even accidentally. But he knew moments like this had their place. People learned from them, sometimes more deeply than they would from lectures or manuals. His mind drifted back to the two officers. He wondered what they were doing now. Maybe sitting somewhere in their station, talking over the events again and again. Maybe feeling embarrassed. Maybe reflecting. He hoped so not, because he wanted them to feel guilty, but because he believed experiences like that shaped people for the better. When he finally stepped back outside, the afternoon sun had softened. A gentle breeze passed through the trees, brushing against his face. A few staff members nodded respectfully as he walked by, but no one disturbed him. He approached one of the waiting vehicles, ready to return to his sister's house before leaving town later that evening. As he opened the door, a young staff member hurried over. "Sir, before you go, there's a message from the local police station. They wanted to apologize again." Daniel paused. "Did they send it formally?" "Yes, sir. And they asked if they could speak with you briefly." "Only if you're willing." Daniel considered it for a moment. He could easily decline. He had no obligation. But he believed in closure not just for himself, but for the officers too. "I'll stop by," he said. "Just for a few minutes." The drive to the small police station was quiet. When Daniel stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The receptionist's eyes widened slightly, and she stood up straighter. She led him down a short hallway where the two officers waited. They stood when he entered. "Sir, thank you for coming," the older officer said, his voice softer than before. Daniel nodded politely. "I thought it would be better if we talked once more." The younger officer swallowed hard. "We're truly sorry for everything. We should have listened. We should have slowed down. You were calm the entire time, and we weren't. It won't happen again." Daniel looked at them carefully, not judging, just understanding. "I'm not here to shame you," he said gently. "You have a difficult job. You deal with emergencies, fear, pressure. It's natural to make mistakes. What matters is learning from them." Both officers nodded. Daniel continued, "Every person you meet has a story. Some carry more responsibility than they show. Some carry more pain than they admit. And some, like me, prefer to stay invisible when we can. But whoever they are, they deserve respect." The officers lowered their heads slightly. "We understand," the older one said. "Thank you for giving us another chance." Daniel offered a small smile. "Everyone deserves one." He shook their hands firmly, calmly, without hesitation. And as he turned to leave, he felt a small sense of peace return. Not because the misunderstanding was resolved, because he had helped guide it to a better ending. Outside, sun was beginning to set, casting the sky in shades of gold and soft orange. Daniel stepped into the vehicle waiting for him. The door closed gently behind him. He leaned back in his seat as the car pulled away from the station. His thoughts drifted back to his sister, probably waiting anxiously at home. He imagined her pacing near the doorway, wondering when he would walk in. He smiled softly. He looked forward to seeing her. The convoy didn't follow him this time. Only one vehicle accompanied him, keeping a respectful distance. He didn't need a grand escort. He never wanted one. When he reached his sister's house, she rushed out the door before the vehicle even stopped. Her relief was instant, written across her face. She pulled him into a tight hug, scolding him lightly for disappearing for so long. "I told you I'd be fine," he said with a quiet laugh. "You always say that," she replied, shaking her head. Inside the house, the warmth of home wrapped around him. The scent of fresh tea, the soft lights, the familiar worn-out sofa, all felt grounding after a long, demanding day. They sat together in the living room. She asked him questions, though not too many, respecting the lines he couldn't cross. He told her enough to ease her worry, but not enough to reveal things she didn't need to carry, as the evening settled in. Daniel looked around the room, grateful for the calm after the storm. The day had been strange, unexpected, and heavier than he would have liked. But it had also held moments of meaning, moments that reminded him why he lived the way he did. He believed in people. He believed in patience. He believed in second chances. and he believed that power wasn't meant to be shown. It was meant to be used quietly, wisely, and only when necessary. When he finally went to bed that night, he slept peacefully, knowing that the day had ended the right way, not with anger or punishment, but with understanding. The officers would remember the lesson, the town would remember the moment, and his sister would remember that her brother, quiet as he was, carried a kind of strength that didn't need to be seen to be real. And as for Daniel, he would wake up tomorrow and continue his work, just as calmly as always, carrying the same certainty he always had. A person didn't need to be loud to make a difference. Sometimes, all it took was calm courage and a voice that knew when to speak.